Chapter 2, the cell. So in your body, you have trillions of cells, approximately 75. The number is much higher if you're a larger person, but cells are microscopic, and we contain or have trillions of cells in our body. So cell theory, this is the theory that all life is cellular and that the building blocks, the fundamental units of life, are cells. Cells are produced by division of pre-existing cells. So you are made up of trillions of cells, and those cells came into existence through mitosis of pre-existing cells. And we'll look at cell division in the sense of mitosis, and that cell division is involved in the growth of an organism, development of the organism, and then maintaining you in your adult state through cell division that will produce new skin cells, for example, and or new blood cells. So two basic types of cells in your body. There are sex cells, or the germ cells, and these are egg and sperm that are produced by females and males. Eggs are also called oocytes. And your other cells, so the vast majority of the cells in your body, are your bodily cells or somatic cells. Soma refers to body, and everything you would see on a particular individual would be their somatic cells. The sex cells are produced in the gametes. I'm sorry, they are gametes, but they are produced in the gonads. Oocytes, eggs, are produced in the ovaries of females, and sperm in the testes of males. Okay? So, very good movie, by the way, if you haven't seen it. Kill Bill, Volume 1. Cellular anatomy. So a little bit on the structure of a cell. So cells vary greatly in size and function. Some are very small. Actually, most are very small. And some are actually extremely long, but still very, very thin and essentially microscopic. So the cell has some components, and this is just a basic schematic, figure 2.2 of a typical cell. It has the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm is the material within the outer plasma membrane. The liquidy environment inside a cell is the cytosol. Think of solution for cell, sol for solution. And then all the structures inside, which are referred to as organelles. Like, literally this means little organ. The structures inside the cells that have particular functions that they do. Some are membranous and some are non-membranous. That simply means that the membranous ones have a membrane surrounding them, sometimes two, and the non-membranous organelles have no membrane surrounding them. You can think of them as like naked organelles. And then the outer boundary of the cell, called the plasma membrane. So zooming into the plasma membrane, there's kind of a lot going on here, but some basic components. 4 major functions of the plasma membrane. It's a physical barrier, so it allows for physical isolation between the internal cytoplasm and the external liquidy environment that's referred to as the extracellular fluid. Most of your cells are surrounded by the extracellular fluid. The membrane also regulates the material that moves into the cell or out of the cell, like nutrients and wastes and such. And it also is involved in being sensitive for recognition of other molecules or cells, and response to other molecules and cells, and for communication. So continuing with sensitivity, for example, cells can communicate with each other through recognizing each other, often through chemical signals. And then in terms of response to molecules and/or chemical signals, you have, for example, white blood cells that are able to identify a foreign cell, like bacterial cell, based on chemicals that bacterial cell has that your white blood cells can recognize, and then they can attack those foreign bacterial cells, and your white immune system cells can communicate with each other also to initiate like the immune system response. And then there's, again, cell-cell communication, which is linked to sensitivity. Cells can literally stick to each other, adhesion, and then the plasma membrane functions in structural support in terms of giving the cells some integrity and structure so that the cells basically don't just simply collapse. So a lot of functions of the plasma membrane. So the parts, the components of the plasma membrane. Most of the plasma membrane, as you see here in your figure 2.3, are these red and blue molecules, kind of like a matchstick in a way with a split wooden part of the matchstick. That molecule is a phospholipid. It's a dual molecule that has in blue lipid or fatty acid chains, and a round, in reality not truly round, a phosphate group containing head. And these heads have a characteristic of being hydrophilic, and the tails have characteristics, chemical characteristics of being hydrophobic. So hydro means water, phobic means repelled by or fear of, and then philic means repelled towards or alike of. So the phospholipids form what's called a phospholipid bilayer. So one of these molecules here is one phospholipid. If you look at the diagram here of the plasma membrane, there's two layers of them. There's one layer here with the phosphate hydrophilic ends exposed to the outer extracellular fluid environment, and then flipped over, there's another layer of phospholipid molecules with the hydrophilic phosphate ends oriented towards the cytoplasm, the internal structure of the cell, which is mostly water, and also the extracellular fluid is mostly water. So the phospholipid molecules orient themselves to form a phospholipid bilayer based on their chemical nature. And the internal part of the membrane, here color-coded in blue, is the hydrophobic tails because they are repelled by water. So they orient themselves naturally towards the center of the plasma membrane. So because of this structure of the plasma membrane, mostly phospholipids in the neighborhood of about 85%, they form this bilayer. Ions and certain water-soluble compounds cannot easily cross because, again, ions and water-soluble compounds are polar or very much like water, and they're not easily able to get across the membrane. Okay? So because of that, the membrane is what we call selectively permeable. Certain substances can easily pass and others cannot. So that's what selectively permeable means. Permeable to certain things, impermeable to other things. So the phospholipids have the hydrophilic phosphate heads and the hydrophobic fatty acid tail chains. And you can see there's other substances, other items embedded in the membrane. Here in yellow, cholesterol. In blue, proteins that we'll get to. The proteins. There are peripheral proteins. Peripheral means on the outside, and they are attached to the membrane surface. For example, here in blue, and these kind of elongated ones in blue. And then there are integral proteins that reach across or span the phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. And they can form channels, as you see here, passageway for substances that get into or out of the cell across the plasma membrane, substances that cannot get across the phospholipid bilayer on their own. And they also function, some of these integral proteins, in that cell-cell recognition function of the plasma membrane, and also acting as receptors. So for example, this protein over here that you can see a little bit in blue might act as a receptor for a molecule in the environment that could latch onto it and possibly cause a change in the behavior of the cell internally. Glycolipids are molecules that have both a carbohydrate and a lipid component. So glycolipids, let me see here. Oh, here we go. Glycolipids. These little structures, the individual ones that look like little six-sided hexagon shapes. Each one of them comprises a simple sugar or a simple carbohydrate. And since they are attached to a phospholipid, the combined molecules referred to as a glycolipid, the glucose sugar component and the lipid phospholipid component. They form part of what's called the glycocalyx, which you can kind of think of it as the sugar coat or the sugar outer portion of the plasma membrane. And there's also glycoproteins. As you see over here, there's a integral protein, color-coded in blue, that's attached to glucose components, or sorry, sugar components. So this combined molecule is referred to as a glycoprotein, just the way this one is here. So both glycoproteins and glycolipids form an external structure referred to as a glycocalyx. And the glycocalyx also functions or is involved in the communication, recognition, and adhesion functions of the plasma membrane. And then sterols, which are molecules that are comprised of excuse me, lipid components. There are steroid alcohols that provide a membrane structure and give the membrane the correct fluidity or a texture in a way. For example, cholesterol, which is in yellow here, is a type of sterol that's involved in giving the plasma membrane its correct fluidity. So it's basically not too rigid or not too fluid. So overall, the plasma membrane can be considered or thought of as a fluid mosaic model, where the plasma membrane is not static. It actually can move around somewhat. The proteins can be made and synthesized by the cell and inserted into the plasma membrane. They can be removed. They can move around and float around. So can the glycolipids and glycoproteins. They can move around. So the plasma membrane is a dynamic fluid type of structure, and it's described by what's called the fluid mosaic model. So it can change in response to cellular needs or demands. Okay, so more on permeability, passive and active processes in terms of moving stuff across the membrane passively, no energy involved, or actively, energy involved in the form of using ATP. So again, the membrane is selectively permeable. The membrane allows certain materials to pass through relatively easy while prohibiting other materials from crossing, hence the term selectively permeable. Passive processes like diffusion occur without the input of energy. Osmosis is simply the diffusion of water, and then also facilitated diffusion, which is diffusion across the plasma membrane with the assistance of a facilitating integral protein. So diffusion and osmosis and facilitated diffusion would occur naturally when substances move from a region of high concentration to a region of their low concentration. So the simple diagram is showing you these green molecules, which are solutes, and a solute is a substance dissolved in a watery aqueous environment. This solute in green, my cursor is going to sleep, the solute in green is diffusing down what we call its concentration gradient from an initial region of high concentration of that particular solute to a region of low concentration. And this is a naturally occurring process. Energy is not required for this to happen. If it's a substance, a solute that can get across the plasma membrane on its own, then it will diffuse across the plasma membrane down its concentration gradient. Water will do this across